Oh, it's really nice to see so many people here. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's annual Exphil lecture. So my name's Joey Pollock. I'm a senior lecturer in philosophy at EFIC. So that's the Department of Philosophy, Classics, History of Art and Ideas at University of Oslo. And I'm also a member of the leader group for the Examen Philosophicum. And so I'll be chairing the event today, but I also wanted to acknowledge and say thank you to everyone who is involved in the organization. This was Raida Maliks, Annelise Backholt-Pound, Camilla Chause, and Sindre Brennhagen. They were the main people responsible for the organization and who've made this event possible today. And so the annual Exphil lecture is a tradition that began in 2017 as a way to celebrate the Examen Philosophicum, which, as many of you will know, is a huge course that forms part of the core curriculum for our students, where we read a mix of historical and contemporary texts covering many different themes in philosophy, ranging from scientific knowledge to environmental ethics and many things in between. And we do this in order to reflect on philosophical problems and also to practice and refine analytical and argumentative skills that can be applied beyond the Exphil curriculum. And so each year we invite an influential philosopher to come to Oslo and to give a lecture on a relevant topic connected with their current philosophical research and interests. And this year we're really delighted to have as our speaker Professor Lea Ypi from the London School of Economics. So she is Professor of Political Theory at LSE. She's also a Fellow of the British Academy, a Fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg in Berlin, and an Honorary Professor in Philosophy at the Australian National University. And so Professor Ypi is a leading scholar in normative political theory, with a focus on democratic theory, theories of justice, and migration, as well as an expert in Enlightenment philosophy, Marxism, critical theory, and also Balkan history and literature. So she's the author of several academic books, including Global Justice and Avant-Garde Political Agency, The Meaning of Partisanship, written with Jonathan White, and The Architectonic of Reason. But she's also known to a much broader audience for her literary work. So her memoir, Free, from 2021, examines life in Albania before and after the dictatorship. And the sequel, Indignity, has been published this year. So Professor Ypi has received many awards for both her academic and literary work. So for example, she's been awarded prizes from the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust for her achievements in research. And her memoir, Free, has won several literary prizes and is featured in lists of best books of the year in many different publications, including The Guardian, New Statesman, and the Sunday Times. And it's also been translated into around 30 languages. So in just a moment, I'll give the floor to Professor Ypi, who will be giving a lecture entitled Are Revolutions Justified? Just so that you know the schedule for the events, after the lecture we'll have two commentators who will give a short response. And so our commentators today are Raida Maliks and Arne Johan Vetlesen. And so once they've given their comments, Professor Ypi will have a chance to respond. And then finally, we'll open the floor to questions from the audience. Okay, so we're ready to begin. So can you please join me in giving our very warm welcome to our speaker this year, Professor Lea Ypi.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. Thank you for this invitation. So my topic today is revolutions, and the first time I asked for a definition of revolution, I was about 11. In my home country, in Albania, about a year after the fall of the Berlin Wall, my mother was involved in the dissident movement that tried to topple communism in Albania, although with a little bit of delay compared to other countries. And I had always heard the term revolution with reference to the past. So in school we talked about the French Revolution, we said how the French Revolution paved the way to the Bolshevik Revolution. But this time it was different because revolution was a word used for the present, and it was happening in the present. And a lot of people talked about revolution on the radio, on television, at home. And I couldn't quite see the connection between the revolutions that I had heard of in school, like the French and the Bolshevik Revolution, and the revolution that seemingly I was witnessing. So at some point I turned to my mom, who considered herself a revolutionary, and so I said to her, "Mom, what is a revolution?" And my mom gave me this long, suspicious look, and she probably suspected I was a spy or something on behalf of the school. And after a long, long silence, she said, "Revolution is a mess." And so I was a bit disappointed by this answer. So I said, "Okay, I get it. I can see that it's a mess. This was very obvious. But what is it?" And she said, "Don't do it." So as you can see, I've kind of followed my mother's advice because I'm not here to do a revolution. I'm only going to talk about it. And actually, I doubt one can start a revolution in Norway anyway, even if one wanted to. But what we can do is actually think a little bit more about the definition of revolution and maybe begin by giving a slightly more exhaustive answer than the one that my mom gave me. And my focus will be on political revolutions, not on revolutions in science or in fashion or in marketing or in personal lives, all of which are realms to which we also apply the term revolution. So a political revolution, in the way in which we most commonly understand the term, is the attempt, sometimes accompanied by violence, to create a new juridical order that fundamentally changes the way things are, the structure of social relations, including political and economic relations. And I'll go back to this definition over the course of my lecture, but now I want to just draw attention to two elements of this definition. The first one is that a revolution is an attempt, and that it's sometimes successful, but that success is not a criterion for defining a revolution. And the second one is that violence is sometimes part of the definition of a revolution, but also that need not be the case, because you can also have peaceful revolutions, or relatively peaceful revolutions, which may be a rare occurrence, but they exist. And so, for example, the Velvet Revolutions in Europe around 1989, or in the Southern Balkans, in my country, were by and large peaceful revolutions. So it's, I think, a mistake to distinguish reforms from revolution based on the degree of violence that they invoke or that they resort to. Sometimes you can have very violent reforms, and sometimes you can have very peaceful revolutions. So a revolution and reform, as one of my favorite thinkers, Rosa Luxemburg, said, they are not different methods of historical progress, and as she says, they're not things that you can pick out from the counter of history in the way you go and buy hot or cold sausages. That was a quote from Luxemburg, depending on whether they are violent or not. And so you say, no, I rather choose this or rather choose that. As Rosa Luxemburg explained, the people who oppose the method of legal reform to the goal of replacing the existing political order don't necessarily oppose a more calm and slow and harmonious, peaceful way of doing things for a different, for a faster and abrupt method. What they do is they choose a different goal. And revolution, as she explains, is the act, this is another quote, the act of political creation, while legislation is the political expression of a life that has already come into being. So this is the relationship between politics and law, and the revolution is something that stands between them. And so in that sense, every process of legal reform has as its basis a revolution that distinguishes it from a previous process of legal reform. So second, other element, it's important to understand that a part of any definition of revolution is that it's about the attempt to change the constitutional, socioeconomic, and political order, rather than the outcome of that attempt. And so here I think it's because we have to also make space for the concept of a failed revolution. So think about the Paris Commune of 1871, or think about the Hungarian Revolution of 1956 that led to the government of Imre Nagy. These were failed revolutions, but as you will see in a minute, it's part of my argument that they are as important and as instructive as successful ones. Okay, so now more broadly, the term revolution, as we are reminded by Hannah Arendt, who was one of the great 20th century scholars to have worried about this idea, originally started circulating in the 14th century as not a political term, but an astronomical one. It came from science. And it was first popularized by Copernicus to indicate the rotation of celestial bodies in the orbit following a certain circular motion in accordance with specific scientific laws. So this early scientific use of the term actually seems to have very little in common with the way in which we now use the term revolution, in particular in political discourse, to indicate an attempt to break, to rupture with a political order while inaugurating this new era of new legal basis for the future order. So the scientific concept, this Copernican concept of revolution, usually tracks ideas of predictability, of foreseeable motion, of circularity. It's about the rotation of orbits, as we just said, in the sun, and conformity to laws. And the political one, or at least intuitively, the way we think about the political one, it's much more about upheaval, about treading through unanticipated paths, creating new political institutions. And so the first one is more about the laws of nature, and the second, the scientific one, is more about the predictability of the way nature works and the laws of nature. And the second one is more about the unpredictability of the imperatives of freedom. But I think this discrepancy in the use of the term revolution and in this gap between the scientific use and the political use of the term is actually settled if you think about how revolutions are usually justified. So for revolutionaries, from their point of view, the political struggles to which they devote their lives are often understood as the return to a natural condition of justice and freedom or peace that has been disrupted. So, in the words of one famous revolutionary, Robespierre, we wish to fulfill the intentions of nature and the destiny of man, realize the promises of philosophy, and acquit providence of a long reign of crime and tyranny. So, this was Robespierre, who thought that virtue is natural in people, and if governments neglect those natural virtues, the light of acknowledged principles, continues the quote, should unmask their treason. So it's the governments that depart from this natural order of reason. And yet, as both philosophers and political revolutionaries know, justice has to have its champions. That's the point of Robespierre, before its principles become political reality. And if those champions weren't there, those principles would never become political reality. So that's why political activity, as another famous revolutionary Lenin emphasizes, citing the socialist Chernyshevsky, quote, is not the pavement of the Nevsky Prospect. So that's the clean, large, smooth pavement that's a perfectly straight main street in St. Petersburg. And those who ignore or forget this truth have paid the costs with innumerable sacrifices. Or, as another revolutionary, maybe more colorful saying goes by Chairman Mao, and you'll probably be all familiar with this, a revolution is not a dinner party. Or, as the quote continues, writing an essay or painting a picture or doing embroidery, he could have added giving a lecture. It cannot be so refined, so leisurely and gentle, so temperate, kind, courteous, restrained, and magnanimous. So that's end of quote. So revolutionaries, it's obvious that they have to put up with significant physical and emotional harm, humiliation, and hostility at the attempt to realize their principles and projects. And they are the kinds of people that remain committed to these principles and projects, even when their feasibility comes under attack, in circumstances where they themselves disagree as revolutionaries among the best way to pursue these principles, in circumstances where it's not really clear what course of action should be recommended and how they should go about realizing these principles in circumstances of high uncertainty. And actually, often revolutionaries are the first victims of their own attempts. So think about, well, Robespierre, who we've just cited, who did not have a happy end to his life, or think about Trotsky, another revolutionary. So most of the time, often, these revolutionaries fail. But sometimes they succeed. And when they succeed, the revolutionaries of the past become the rulers of the present. And if their governments are to be considered legitimate in the eyes of the whole people, they have to rule in the name of everyone, with the support of everyone. So they have to rule not just on behalf of the fellow revolutionaries who endorsed and were always on board with these projects and shared the hardship with them, but they also have to rule in the name of everyone else. So the people who were first persuaded, then decided to change their mind, the politicians who made decisions to persecute them, the bureaucrats who implemented these decisions, the militaries who tortured them, others who shot them. So they have to create, as a new government that emerges from the revolution, the kind of institutional order that is able to control and to have widespread allegiance and act on behalf of a unified political body, and that includes the people who disrupted them and who were against them, and includes the people who did not give such allegiance in the first place. So, in a way, for this transition to be possible, the revolutionaries of the present, they have to forget that that's what they are, that they have to forget their revolutionary past. And so extremism becomes a kind of infantile disorder, as, again, Lenin famously wrote. And that's because the refusal to negotiate that characterizes the initial phases of the revolutionary struggle must inevitably give way to the compromises of governing. And so from their point of view, the last revolution is always the final one. There is no other revolution possible. So that's a kind of natural instinct. The more new revolutionary institutions are perceived as the result of divisive struggles, the less secure the foundations of the new order are, and the less legitimate the new government will appear to its critics. So legitimacy will be undermined. But the more these revolutionary principles that have been obtained as a result of these struggles and hardships enter the realm of compromise and of negotiation and ongoing deliberation about their meaning, their function, their legitimacy, the more the revolutionary spirit is sacrificed. And so it looks like justice will not have been fully done. So that's why all this long introduction is to say that for this reason, revolutions are very ambiguous phenomena, because morality, this moral drive, this principled commitment, is necessary to their origins, but it's a condition of success that the moral point of view at some point has to give way to the legal point of view. So they can't just continue with this moral commitment. So that means that there is a kind of tension there that means that the genesis of revolutions, which is a moral genesis, somehow is in tension with their ongoing validity of the results of revolution. And so that's why I think this explains why the question of whether revolutions are justified or not is subject to these two different ways of thinking about them, these two different opposite approaches. So there are some people who criticize them on grounds of institutional legalism, and the people who endorse them on grounds of idealist moralism, let's say. So moralists think that because the ends of revolution are right, revolution can't really be wrong. And legalists think that because the means of revolution are wrong, the principles, revolution itself can never be right. So I just want to my lecture revisit these arguments and maybe offer an alternative that tries to cut across this divide by asking the question of revolution from a different perspective, not in relation to the justice of specific people, but based on something that I'll call a philosophical way of thinking about history that focuses on collective progress. And before I do that, I want to look at the arguments of both moralists and legalists in a little bit more detail and then say something more about my own approach. So in defending revolution, moralists hold on to this notion of valid claims that trumps whatever standing, whatever legitimacy existing authorities have. These are, different ways of articulating what counts as a valid claim, and I'm very ecumenical at this point. You might say that people have natural rights or human rights that no authority should violate, that the state should respect, otherwise the state fails to have legitimacy. But you can also be skeptic of the language of rights and human rights and say that, or you might say that the state is actually necessary to understanding what counts as a right. And so another option might be to say that individuals have basic interests that institutions should be tracking, or that these interests are justified in a certain way if you have doubts about how you think about interests. So you might then appeal to a way of thinking about values that you expect authorities to reflect, so that our consent to authorities is premised on them reflecting those values, and to say that when political institutions don't reflect these moral commitments, people surely have a right to a revolution. So that's one position. They must be able, if they're justified in their aims, they must be able to right the wrong on which politics is premised, on which institutions are premised. So this is the moralist position, to which the legalists give a number of responses. And the first one is prudential. So they say, look, most revolutions end up in carnage. They involve widespread unrest, they involve protests, they sometimes involve armed conflict. They can result in a lot of harm to individuals and to communities. They can bring to the displacement of population, and they might violate whatever existing rights people have without actually giving you new rights. So they take away what there is, but don't really offer anything better. The second argument, the second objection to this moralism of revolutions is about the mechanisms of change. So many people, many critics of revolution argue that all other things equal, you should try and reform the existing order rather than subvert it. You should work with existing political and institutional structures. And so the existing rule of law, they would say, is really important to preserve both justice and stability. And to the extent that revolutionaries position themselves outside this existing legal and political framework, they are unreliable guides, because the arbitrariness with which they come to power risks becoming entrenched in the institutions that they create, and so risks sanctioning then future arbitrary behavior. So that explains why intellectuals who often in principle like the idea of revolution and support revolutions in general often end up disliking any concrete manifestation of any specific revolution. So, to give you an example, just think about Orwell's position in vis-à-vis the Bolshevik Revolution, and think about, for those of you who have read the end of the famous novel Animal Farm. A few years after the revolution, the farm animals witness Napoleon the pig playing cards with Mr. Pickleton, and Orwell gives you this devastating final sentence to Animal Farm, quote, 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question now what had happened to the faces of the pigs. The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. So I actually recently read that when people cite Animal Farm, it's because I haven't read many books. I promise you I do read. But the point made by Orwell is actually a very familiar one, and it's an important one to illustrate this point, that since revolutionaries themselves often end up betraying their principles, one might applaud revolutions in general, but conclude that any particular concrete, specific revolution is not to be preferred to another kind of approach that is more gradual and more evolutionary, different approach to change, to social change. Okay. So there's one last objection to revolutions that I find more plausible, and this is the one that I'm now going to articulate and to which I will connect myself. And that's the one that's formulated in the writings of my favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And I pick Kant not just because I'm a Kant scholar, which is always a good reason to pick someone that you know, but because Kant is famous for a really strange position on revolutions. So he rejected, so it's almost the opposite of Orwell. He rejected the revolution in general, but he really loved one particular revolution, and that was the French one. So, as I say, in this case, his position is perplexing because it's almost the exact opposite of most intellectuals' positions, which is more like the Orwell one. You like the idea of revolution, but then you fall out with specific revolutions, whereas Kant didn't like the idea of a general idea of revolution, but actually really loved the specific one. And apparently, when he received news from his servant of the installment of the Republic in France following the successful French Revolution, Kant was at that point 65 years old and, as you know, never left Königsberg, so he just had to wait for news to go to him. And he says, and I quote, "Now I can say like Simon, God, let your servant die in peace since I've already lived this memorable day." So Kant was happy to die after the French Revolution. And actually, around 1793, in case you thought he only liked the French Revolution at the beginning, but then also didn't like it that much, 1793, which is at exactly the time at which the French Revolution had entered its most destructive phase. This was the darkest phase, the period of terror. And a lot of his colleagues started having second thoughts, like Orwell. Well, maybe they've gone too far, maybe this was not such a good idea, and so on. Kant became even more enthusiastic. So one of his students and later colleagues, Friedrich Nicolavius, reported that Kant insisted, and I quote, that all the horrors that took place in France were nothing compared to those people had suffered under a despotic regime. And, continues the quote, the Jacobins were probably right in all their actions. But Kant now is also famous for insisting on something else, which is that revolutions in general can never be justified. A people, this is another quote from another part of Kant, a people, he says, have a duty not to rebel, even against an unjust government. Why? As he puts it, there is no right to sedition, still less a right to rebellion, and least of all, there is a right against the head of a state to attack his person or even his life. And he goes even further when he argues that a people, again a quote, has a duty to put up with even what is held to be an unbearable abuse of supreme authority. Now, some scholars, including myself, have actually written along about this, and Rader will know a lot more about this debate than I do, but they argue that Kant wrote this because the Jacobins, at the point in which he was writing those sentences, were in government. And so he wanted to make sure that they weren't overthrown. So he came up with this right against revolution to make sure that the counter-revolutionaries of the French revolutionaries didn't overthrow them. But actually here I want to explore more the philosophical question, and so leave the historical details to one side and explore the question of why Kant thought revolutions were wrong, without maybe reducing the question to just this position that he takes vis-à-vis the Jacobins, which I think historically, as I say, is relatively plausible, but without, becoming a kind of Jacobin club gossip about why Kant was, what contingent reasons and what political motivation Kant had for what he said. So, the justification for revolutions is incompatible with something that Kant calls the transcendental formula of public right. It says, all actions regarding to the rights of others are wrong if their maxim is incompatible with publicity. That's his argument against revolution. And the principle that motivates revolutions, even against an unjust government, is inconsistent with this principle of publicity, Kant thought, because if the principles of revolutionaries were universalized, they would make their own purpose impossible. So let me unpack this a little bit more. Kant's rationale against revolution is actually the same rationale that he deploys in all his writings on colonialism, against European civilizing missions in other parts of the world, against what we might nowadays call humanitarian war. Basically, his argument is that a group of people can't unilaterally use coercion to change from the outside the structure of social relations that are already based on some principle of right, however inadequate that principle is. So a group of people, which is a constituted group of people in some public body or other, Kant thought already reflects a kind of principle of right, however provisional and however inadequate, and already reflects a will of a people to joint rule. So a state is a state because it reflects a form of collective willing that is different from the anarchy of individuals in the state of nature. That was Kant's argument. And so the reasons for rejecting revolution are the same reasons that Kant has for rejecting interventions on behalf of other authorities. And the argument is that there is a point of transition where all public authority is destroyed and the conditions on which the principles of right are grounded are annihilated. So to have right, you have to have a public authority, and in this transition from one stage to another, the possibility of having a public authority is ruined, and Kant's argument for why it's always good to have a public authority rather than not is that a publicly recognizable authority makes sure that individual claims are recognized and become solid, as it were. So the people's mutual submission to the state or to the law is the foundation for them making claims that are reciprocally binding on each other, that they can use the coercive power of that authority to make reciprocally binding claims. So what do revolutionaries do? Revolutionaries attempt to dismantle that political authority, and therefore their approach, that's why on principle you can never justify a revolution, because they undermine the basis on which reciprocal claims of right can be made. So, to put it differently, revolutionaries place themselves outside the sphere of these publicly recognizable rights, and in doing so act unilaterally. But any unilateral act that is placed outside this context of public recognition is for Kant wrong, intrinsically wrong. So what revolutionaries do is they impose coercive obligations on others, but outside the only context in which this reciprocal imposition of obligations makes sense. So I think this is a coherent position. And again, I think it's a coherent position that is historically revealed in this tension that I was outlining at the beginning between the claims of revolutionaries when they're outside the state and the claims of revolutionaries when they become government and the revolution is successful, and in this shift from the partial point of view that they have as revolutionaries to the universal point of view that they deploy when they represent the legitimate government. So my question is, taking this on board, and we can discuss it, maybe not everyone is convinced of this, but assuming that Kant is right about this rejection of revolutions in principle, is there anything else that we can say about the desirability of revolutions in general and the ambiguity of particular revolutions, to go back to this Kantian initial tension and dilemma? So one way to resolve this tension is by, as I said, shifting perspectives. And my suggestion here is to not focus on the actions of particular individuals in existing circumstances, but on the rationale for revolutions by thinking about a different standpoint, and a standpoint that I will call, in a somewhat old-fashioned way, and for want of a better term, the standpoint of the species being. So the standpoint of the human being as a species. So what is the species being? Marxists will know this already, but for those of you who don't know Marx or don't like it, it's a way of talking about humanity that goes beyond existing individuals here and now, and that tries to move beyond the existence in a particular point in time, and to reflect more holistically about humanity as a temporally stretched moral relation. So if we distinguish these two perspectives, the perspective of the individual, of the here and now, and the perspective of the species, so this temporally stretched individual, we can understand, I think, why an event that seems really hard to justify for specific agents here and now becomes actually something that might contribute to progress from a more general historical perspective, from a moral perspective. So, to put it differently, my suggestion is that it might be misleading to try and answer the question of the justification of revolution by thinking just about the specific standpoint of the agents or the authority of a group that has to make claims on behalf of everyone else. Instead, the strategy of justification, or maybe you don't have to use the term justification at all, but is to reflect on revolutions by looking at their contribution in history from a more general historical perspective. And I'm going to, in the time that I have left, 20 minutes or so, try and unpack what this means. And I'm going to do that by helping myself to some elements of Kant's philosophy that I think are still plausible and still useful to make sense of the present. So we already talked about Kant's rejection of revolution in general, and I think I'm going to take my cues from Kant's defense of this specific revolution, the French Revolution, to try and unpack this argument of this of the standpoint of the species, as it were. So that is an argument that comes out most clearly in Kant's famous essay on the conflict of the faculties, and is raised, this discussion around the French Revolution emerges in the context of a more general question Kant asks in that essay, which is the question of progress. So can we make progress? Do we make political progress? And actually unfolds through a reflection on alternative ways of thinking about progress, alternative moral theories that approach the question of progress. And the basic intuition, the basic starting point is, if we acknowledge the force of moral norms, is there any evidence that these moral norms have any purchase in the world in which we live? So the moral norms are the norms of the moral agent. The world is not made of only moral agents, and we can see that. I think we can see that even more these days. So basically Kant says, is there any occurrence or event or sign, empirical manifestation that can give us hope about the prospects of morality in the world in which we live? And Kant says, look, it's really hard to answer that question, and the problem is that we are dealing with free human beings who moral norms tell them what they ought to do, but then they also can ignore, because they have freedom, because they have free will, they can also ignore the moral norms, and so go and do something completely different. And actually external circumstances conspire often against them. So there is ideology, there is false consciousness, there is brute force. So to ask the question of whether moral norms can have an effect in the world when humans actually act rather than just thinking about these norms, is to ask the question of whether we can single out an event or an occurrence or a sign that points to the disposition of humans towards the better. And of course, Kant is very aware that to say that something is possible does not mean to say that it will occur. And that's because from this cause you can have an effect only if that effect is brought about by the agents who are engaging with it. And so all we can have, therefore, is not an analysis of the causes of moral progress, but a sign of moral progress. And I think it's really important that we're talking about causes, that we're not talking about causes, but we're talking about signs. Because if progress was causal, it wouldn't be irreversible. And if that were the case, so it would be irreversible. If you had causal progress, you wouldn't be able to take it back. It would just be one linear building towards this moral progress. But then you wouldn't explain how, if progress is irreversible, how you could have something like the Holocaust after Kant, or how we could now be on the brink of environmental disaster, for example. So a sign is just a sign. It's not a cause. And it's an empirically observable phenomenon of a moral disposition, and it's, however, a moral disposition that is apparent in this sign that tells us something about the human being more generally. So what does it tell us? On Kant's account, revolutions are key events in philosophical history. That is to say, a kind of history that privileges a certain moral perspective in the reconstruction of events within an understanding of humanity as a species being, that is to say, of humanity as a set of normatively relevant, let's say, properties and moral relations. So for Kant, the French Revolution gives just this perspective. It's a historical sign of progress. But now, why is revolution the sign? And why does it pay to think about this idea that it's an event of this kind that gives us a sign of moral progress? And it's worth asking this question because it's worth thinking about the alternatives that Kant had of other philosophers, other historians of political thought, who had also asked this question of progress and who didn't think that when you ask yourself about signs, then this immediately triggers the question of a revolution as a possible sign. So Kant doesn't focus, as other philosophers did before him, on the great actions of human beings. Someone like Voltaire, for example, wrote about the century of Louis XIV as a model of progress. Before that, Machiavelli in the discourses on Livy, or Montesquieu on the kind of considerations of the decline and greatness of the Romans, also focused on single historical figures and leaders as examples of moral progress. So Kant focuses on something very different that was just beginning to emerge in the 18th century, but is very much with us, that is the public sphere. As he focuses on the public reaction triggered by the events of the French Revolution, or as he puts it, on, quote, the mode of thinking of the spectators, the attitudes they reveal publicly in this great game of revolutions. And that attitude, Kant thought, shows us a disinterested sympathy for the players of one side rather than the other, even at the risk that this partiality for revolution, so this support for the French Revolution, would actually harm their own prospects, their own self-interest if it were discovered. So it's interesting here that, as I say, unlike these other examples of progress, unlike the justification of revolutions in general, here it's the partiality of an impartial public towards the revolutionaries that is celebrated. And that, quote, Kant emphasizes, is the wishful participation of the spectators, so the spectators of the French Revolution, that borders on enthusiasm, the very expression of which is fraught with danger. So that response, why does Kant take that as a sign of progress? Because that response to the French Revolution, the enthusiasm that it triggers, shows us that human beings are capable of being motivated by feelings other than their own self-interest. And so this disinterestedness of the spectators shows us this moral cause at work. And that's why Kant identifies it as a sign of moral progress. It's in the feeling triggered by this disposition to act from duty, even when you're harming your own personal self-interest or when it's against your advantage. So and I'm going to unpack this a little bit more now. So what is this feeling of enthusiasm, and why does it help us understand revolutions as a sign of progress, and why does it contribute to providing this visible evidence of humanity moving towards the better? So what is the nature of the link between revolution as a sign of moral progress and, on the other hand, the sentimental manifestation of the sign, which is the enthusiasm for the revolution? And here there's two arguments that Kant makes, and I think there are two arguments that one can make in general about this. The first one is an argument about the boundaries of feasibility, and the second one is about the cultural effects of a certain kind of education, of political education. So let me start with feasibility. How many times you have heard or you have suggested a radical idea or a proposal or a political vision and heard that sounds great in theory, and this is great in the world of ideas, but it doesn't actually work in practice. So when our current Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, was recently in the UK, was recently accused of breaking several campaign pledges, he said, I have to be realistic about what is possible. In other words, I have to lie because it's a tough world out there. So now this is Kant's reply to this. What is and isn't possible depends on different interpretations and depends on the malleability nature of facts. There are no hard facts when we're talking about the social world. Behind every fact, there is an interpretation of that fact. And so our assessment of what is and isn't realistic about facts depends on how we balance our priorities, how we think about the facts, how we order them, how we value them, and so on. And there are a lot of proposals that make some idea unrealistic. So they might be, people are thought to be too scared. They might be ideologically motivated. They might be afraid to speak their mind out. They might be manipulated by propaganda and saying certain things. They might be at the mercy of fake news, you name it. So all of this was as true in the time in which Kant lived as it is in our time. But for Kant, the presence of this revolutionary enthusiasm shows that people are capable of going beyond all that, even when this enthusiasm is fraught with danger. And so enthusiasm is the visible sign of this identification of the cause of the public with the cause of the revolutionaries who advance it in the name of the whole of humanity. And in this conscious coming together of the public on the one hand and the revolutionaries on the other, what happens is a process of public enlightenment, as Kant thought it, some kind of emergence from this self-incurred immaturity. and the boundaries of political feasibility as a result of this begin to change. So circumstances are no longer seen as unchangeable. You no longer take the authority of the king for granted or the authority of the church for granted. You see that it can actually be different for you, even if you live in Germany and the revolution only has happened in France. So progress is not a question of guarantees in the abstract, but becomes a question of concrete political action. And change, the kind of change that was thought unrealistic up to that point, begins to happen. So that's one way of thinking about progress. Now, is this action of the revolutionaries, as they operate in this way, as they change the boundaries of feasibility, unilateral? Yes, it is. So empirically speaking, this is a work of a group. It's not the work of everyone. And there were, as it happens, Kant says, everyone identifies with the French Revolution, but as it happens, even in the time of Kant, this was plainly false. Not everyone identified with the French Revolution. So for one, Edmund Burke was not one that identified with the French Revolution. If anything, he identified with the opposite. So for Kant, it mattered that revolutionaries acted in the name of universal principles and that there was a ground to this identification and that there was a direction to this political change. And that's why the philosophical view on history here is slightly different from the philosophical view on the state. So Kant thinks that the French Revolution is valuable because politically it culminates in the achievement of a formal condition through which human beings can resolve their reciprocal disagreements by appealing to principles of right rather than might. And we now, of course, know that Kant might have been optimistic, so he thought that the French Revolution would change this. We know that it didn't change everything. But I think the challenge that he gives us about universal conditions of principles of right is one that needs to be taken up rather than rejected because it failed. So it's easy to see how, insofar as the French revolutionaries contribute to the establishment of a world idea based on a principle of mutual recognition and on the value of freedom and equality, they are contribute to an Enlightenment project, which we might say now is unfinished, but is an important starting point for whatever future projects need to unfold from there. So finally, another line of thinking, this has to do, as I said earlier, with the aesthetic effects of revolution. So one argument was about the changing in the boundaries of political feasibility. The second one is the enthusiasm as a kind of feeling triggered in the spectators that Kant talks about. And this is the aesthetic role of revolution. Because while the political change that revolutionaries bring about is understood in terms of kind of making laws that reflect our moral commitments, this second dimension of enthusiasm has to do with the impact of revolutionary change on culture more broadly. So it's not something that is restricted to the changes in the political sphere. It's more about what is the legacy of these political changes in broader culture. And here, enthusiasm, which is this kind of mode of thinking that Kant singles out as relevant to understand the effects of the French Revolution, is part of a process of moral education. As he puts it in the third critique, enthusiasm is the marker of a sublime state of mind, and the sublime is defined as the idea of the good with effect. And that is a condition without which Kant says nothing great can be achieved. So you have to have this somehow sentimental or feelings-based sense of duty. So enthusiasm, Kant thought, is aesthetically sublime because it stretches the powers of the mind through ideas, and it gives the mind a kind of momentum that makes it then act far more powerfully and persistently than other sort of sensory representations. That was all the quote. So enthusiasm is a kind of important aesthetic disposition because it influences agents' resolution to follow reason, and it represents the kind of power of moral ideas from a symbolic perspective. So the sublime, Kant says, is grounded on freedom on the one hand, but requires cultivation in order to be perceived as elevating. And that's why the sublime goes together with a certain kind of cultural change and with a certain reception of political change into the wider culture. But the nature of this process of cultural education is one that is such that it can't be, again, accomplished in the lifespan of single individuals. And so the effects of the French Revolution, for example, as Kant explains in this essay on progress, on the broader public are such that they would remain even if the events themselves take a different course. So because this is a different kind of, it works on the mind and it works on the public in a different way from political change, even if the occurrence disappears, so even if the French Revolution gets defeated at some point, and this goes back to my initial argument about the importance of failed revolution, not necessarily successful ones, human history will proceed through these repeated attempts to realize freedom, and so the collective memory of these emancipatory events that are tried in the past is then inherited by future generations and makes this part of this collective learning process. So it's through this repeated process of trial and failure that this constitution that we all would like to have, this ideal constitution with ideal principles of rights and justice, comes to obtain a kind of constancy that means that with progressive efforts it becomes more viable in the long term. Now, you might say, why does this not apply to any other collective event? So what's so special about revolution? You might say, the revolution moves us in this way and has a legacy. So why does Kant say that it's revolution rather than another collective event that also has a cultural legacy? So war, for example. So you might say, war has the same capacity to move us, and war also leaves long-lasting traces in culture. And the difference here is, I think, in the disposition. So war makes us give up on humanity. It doesn't cultivate humanity. Whereas with revolutions, even when they fail, they kind of affirm humanity because they affirm this struggle. So the purpose of war is annihilation of the other party. The purpose of revolution is the bringing out of a different order. And there is not really enthusiasm in war. At most, you can have celebrations of heroism, for example. So the right attitude to these revolutions of the past, including the failed revolutions of the past, is neither for Kant nostalgia nor outright rejection, because the point is to insist on the relevance of the experience of revolution for the collective memory of those who observe it or inherit the legacy of it, either directly or through cultural artifacts, literature, cinema, paintings, what have you. And to think about revolutions as related to this experience of historical progress means that you're not really hostage to the past, because you're not idealizing one specific revolution, but more to find this evidence of the power of moral ideas in the enthusiasm that is brought about by these transformative political events. And of course, you also find, you don't find just enthusiasm, you also find disappointment and disillusionment, but it's a kind of disappointment that turns into future resistance when it comes into this aesthetic setting. So revolutionary events play an educative function in addition to a politically emancipatory one. And that means that for Kant, this is why the second argument is also really important about the aesthetic effects of revolution, their memory matters as much as the actual occurrence in the process of aesthetic education of human beings. Okay, I'm now really going to conclude. So revolutions, I said, transform the conceptual categories and the normative categories that we have available, and on the one hand, change the boundaries of what is feasible. Across space, they contribute to politically emancipatory processes that widen the horizons of political judgment and change our assessment of what is and isn't possible in the future. So that's the feasibility argument, and it's a spatial argument. Across time, they play a kind of morally educative role in developing a learning process through which future generations benefit. So after all this, you might say, so are revolutions justified or not? Well, maybe that's the wrong question. So actually, and I mean, no one's ever asked, can I please have a revolution, when they were about to start one. So, and certainly didn't decide what to do on the basis of what some philosopher in Oslo or London told them, what was desirable or undesirable. So the point here is that revolutions happen, they have always happened, and they will probably continue to happen, whether we think they ought to happen or not. And so what we need to recover is our ability to reflect on their contribution to the question of moral progress by reflecting on the criteria and the principles that they promote in any particular point in time, and the question of how these principles relate to what Kant would call the interests of humanity as a whole. So these days, people think that when you talk about the interests of humanity, this is another way of justifying colonial domination or colonialism or imperialism, and I hope to have made it clear that that is not my intention. And among other things, because I come from Albania, and so we were never actually started any imperial project. But more seriously, I don't think colonialism and imperialism has the interests of the species in sight. And they failed not because they were universal, but because they weren't universal enough. They were not universal. So the point is rather to understand that while the causes of political change are always bound up with these specific empirical processes of both conflict and cooperation, the way we address these political challenges is different at different historical points, but needs to be somehow able to connect what happens in the present with what happens in the past so that we can think about the future in a certain way. And to learn from the past, we need to be able to see the past not just as this random contingent occurrence of events and characters, but to observe it from a philosophical perspective. So to ask yourself a moral question. When and how do these events promote these moral dispositions, and when do they hinder them? And so that's why, for me, the key question isn't so much whether revolutions are justified or not, but rather what we can do to ensure that the next revolution is actually one that can avoid to repeat the errors of the previous revolution. And so for this, Kant thought we need a kind of philosophy of history, and indeed a kind of philosophy of history that is centered on revolutions as these transition moments where the question of the signs of progress can be posed, and where the question of progress is connected not to individuals, as in either the legalist or the moralist perspective that I started with, but to the point of view of the species as a whole. And I think Kant was right on this one. Thank you.
Talk. So it's now time for our first commentator. So this is Malik. So Radar is professor of philosophy at the University of Oslo, and he specializes in political philosophy and the history of political thought, with a particular emphasis on Immanuel Kant. He's currently leading a research project on the Kantian foundations of democracy. So go ahead, Radar.
Thank you. Let me start by saying how much I enjoyed reading this wonderfully original and thought-provoking essay. I'll have comments on three issues: the definition of revolution, Kant's view on the French Revolution, and the value of revolutions. Sorry? I'll use it like that. Okay. So I have three themes: the definition of revolution, Kant's view of the French Revolution, and finally on the value of revolution in this philosophical history. Now, just to sum up the lecture a little bit, the core of Professor Ypi's paper is an argument for the historical significance of revolutions in advancing humanity's progress. Avoiding a moral evaluation of the actions and the aims of revolutionaries, she investigates the effects of those who experience revolutions. Drawing on an idea from Kant, she maintains that revolutions generate enthusiasm, which reveals humanity's disposition and capacity for moral agency. In this way, revolutions become a source of hope. Although she ostensibly rejects the attempt to justify revolutions from a normative standpoint, she comes close to suggesting that they may be justified for their contribution to moral progress. Now I'll start my first comment, and I'm beginning with Lea's definition of revolution, as I'm not convinced that it sufficiently distinguishes revolution from reform. She defines political revolution as, and I'm quoting, the attempt sometimes accompanied by violence to create a new juridical order that fundamentally changes the structure of social relations, including political and economic ones. My concern is that this definition does not specify the means that revolutionaries employ. in my view, it's essential to revolutions that they proceed by extra-constitutional means. I agree with Lea that revolutions need not necessarily resort to violence. Yet even the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia in 1989, sorry, I almost said 1789, it involved activities outlawed by the state, such as publishing subversive literature and holding unauthorized protests. It may seem trivial to note that revolutionaries break the law, but this is precisely what marks the boundary between revolution and reform. The difference between a constituent assembly established to draft the constitution and, on the other hand, a revolutionary movement seeking to refound society does not lie in their goals. Both aim to transform legal and social and political structures. They differ in their methods. A constituent assembly operates through established procedures, while revolutionaries act outside of the constitutional framework. For this reason, I disagree with Rosa Luxemburg's claim, quoted in Lea's essay, that revolutionaries and reformists differ in their goals. According to Luxemburg, revolution's goal is the act of creation, while reform merely expresses existing life. Yet there is no reason to believe that ordinary legislation cannot be equally creative, simply because it occurs within established boundaries. Those boundaries may constrain, but the authority of a constituent assembly can include the power to redefine them. History shows that reforms can be as radical and enduring as revolutions. Universal suffrage, welfare rights, and the recognition of minorities have historically also been achieved without revolutions, although it helps to have protests, strikes, and public agitation. We should therefore abandon the idea that reforms necessarily pursue lesser or less consequential goals. Reform is limited by its means, not by its ends. I now turn to Kant's view of the French Revolution. I'm somewhat hesitant by the claim that he defended the revolution or the actions of the revolutionaries. I do not doubt that Kant welcomed the revolution's goals and its outcomes, particularly the introduction of a republican constitution. But it's one thing to approve of a revolution's goals and consequences, and another thing to approve of the revolution's methods. I do not believe Kant's argument in the conflict of the faculties amounts to a defense of the revolution itself. Rather, Kant's focus is on the spectators of the revolution in Germany, many of them his own followers. He seeks to show that, even though they felt enthusiasm for the revolution and were inclined to assist, they nonetheless obeyed duty and advocated reform instead. This demonstrated to Kant humanity's capacity to act out of respect for the law. Thus, Kant's purpose in mentioning revolutionary enthusiasm is primarily to reveal moral motivation by contrasting inclination and duty, a strategy well known from his moral writings. However, when Lea claims that Kant justified the revolution, she also refers to a justification from the perspective of philosophical history. The revolution, she argues, was so valuable that, quote, what seems unacceptable from the point of view of the present can be justified in hindsight. Paradoxically, the revolution is morally wrong, yet historically justified. This teleological justification depends on nature or providence working behind the backs of agents. But if everything that contributes to moral progress is part of nature's justification, then wars too would be justified insofar as they provoke nations to establish an international federation for peace. Wars may not generate enthusiasm, and they're in no way a sign of the predisposition of morality for humans, But why should that matter to philosophical history if they also advance moral progress? The next question is whether Lea intends to generalize Kant's interpretation of the French Revolution. Do all revolutions, not just the French, expand the feasibility for moral agency through the enthusiasm they generate? If so, I wonder in what sense this can truly be the case. The French Revolution was special in combining the pursuit of emancipation with the establishment of a constitution of freedom as its aim. For Kant, the moral goal was what stirred enthusiasm. But what about other revolutions? Since Lea's definition of revolution is neutral regarding revolutionary aims, would it not include communist, theocratic, and monarchical revolutions alike? How could all of these generate morally relevant enthusiasm? Consider, for example, a hypothetical revolutionary group in the United States seeking to abolish democracy and establish a monarchy. Let's call it Project 2028. Such a movement would aim to replace the Constitution with an executive akin to a corporate CEO of a major tech firm. It might generate excitement among certain segments in society. Yet this revolution would contradict everything Kant associated with moral goodness and could not manifest the moral enthusiasm Lea attributes to revolutions. It would not advance enlightenment or progress, though it would still qualify as a revolution. To avoid that, it seems like a selection of relevant revolutions would have to be made. But then, in choosing a criterion, their actions and aims must be taken into account, although the actions and aims are not the topic for Lea. She's focusing on their effects. So, if not all revolutions are included, how then do we distinguish? My final point is about the value of revolutions within philosophical history, and I want to address an ambiguity in Lea's argument. She proposes an alternative to moral and legal justifications, claiming her goal is merely to examine the effects of revolutions. Yet she also maintains that revolutions can be justified retrospectively based on their beneficial contribution to humanity's moral progress. If that is so, it seems she has not abandoned normative justifications, but merely replaced it with a new normative framework, one that justifies revolutions by their eventual benefit to humanity. This approach is peculiar in that it can only operate retrospectively at the proverbial dusk of history when the owl of Minerva takes its flight. It can only be applied after the fact, since whether certain events in fact promote or hinder moral dispositions can be assessed only in hindsight. To invoke such reasoning amid unfolding events would amount to claiming that history can vindicate an agent's actions, a problematic view since full judgment is possible only when all involved are dead and can no longer be held accountable. Thus, I'd like to know more and have more of an extended articulation of the normative commitments of philosophical history. If, on the other hand, Lea's project has no normative intent and aims merely to describe the effects of revolutions on human agency, then we must join the historical sociologists who have pursued that inquiry. In that case, the appropriate methods cannot be limited to philosophical history, but must include the tools of the social sciences. Moreover, such inquiry cannot presuppose that the story of humanity is one of steady moral progress, as that assumption would bias the analysis. Although it would be history in the service of a noble goal, it would instrumentalize the past for present purposes. So my final question is, how should we align philosophical history with the methods and aims of the social sciences? Thank you.
Okay, so thank you, Radar. So our second and final commentator is Arne Johan Vetlesen, who's also a professor of philosophy here at UIO. So his research includes political philosophy, ethics, and environmental philosophy, and explores themes including freedom, suffering, and evil, as well as the intrinsic value of nature in the context of the ecological crisis. So go ahead, Arne Johan.
Yeah. Thank you for your lecture, Lea, and congratulations on drawing a full auditorium. Should be like that, of course, for every Exphil lecture. Yes, my comments will be brief to your relief, and they will deviate somewhat from Lea's lecture, and they will deviate somewhat from Reidar Malik's comments, but there will also be a common critical point. So I have two comments. Let me start by reading out some quotations from early Frankfurt School critical theory. So we start with this one, Theodor Adorno. We are faced with the absurdity that it is progress itself that inhibits progress. The next one. There is no universal history leading from savagery to humanitarianism, but there is one leading from the slingshot to the megaton bomb. Walter Benjamin. Dass es so weitergeht, ist die Katastrophe. Another one from Walter Benjamin. Every document of culture is also a document of barbarism. Progress in the mastery of nature is dialectically tied to the regression of society. Yeah. Then there is Walter Benjamin's 11th thesis on the philosophy of history. He comments on Marx's thesis that revolutions are the locomotive of world history. The opposite, comments Walter Benjamin, may well be the case. Perhaps revolutions are an attempt by the passengers on the train to activate the emergency brake. This then is about halting the catastrophic trajectory of history that typically plays out in the name of progress. This leads me to the second comment. Yeah. So in the lecture, political revolutions were defined, as Reidar Malik also just quoted, to create a new juridical order, to fundamentally change the way things are, economically, and so on, and sometimes involving a resort to violence. So the lecture very much was premised on an understanding of revolution such that they are attempts at creating progress, are inspired by this attempt in the name of progress, as we understand it from the French Revolution. Progress being about liberty, equality, solidarity, fraternité, justice. And Lea added about widening our horizon. Now I will give another quote. Professors are the enemy. End of quote. Who said this? Okay. J.D. Vance, quoting Richard Nixon. So, this touches upon one of the points made by Reidar Malik, to do with raising a question about revolution, not necessarily being an attempt, as we would understand it, to create progress in the given sense. The question then is, who are the revolutionaries, say, in today's world? Who is to decide on this question? The agents themselves, spectators, or philosophers? This quote, professors are the enemy, is, as you well know, or ought to know, part of Project 2025, well, let's talk about 2028, doesn't matter. 3 targets are singled out in particular in this project: the courts or the judiciary, the press, and last but not least for this audience, the academy. Of course, we will say, I guess most of the people in this room, that this project deviates from, or even negates, what Lea has talked about as revolution, in that this is not about creating institutions or widening the horizon, It is rather about dismantling existing institutions. In other words, not about creation, but destruction. Not widening the horizon, but shrinking it. My question to Lea is, if, and if so, how, her perspective, very much inspired by Kant, Kant's view on the French Revolution, can help shed light on the situation today, especially in the United States. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, for these great comments, which I'll start with one of the questions that Ray there asked, but I think comes up in your question, Arne, as well, which is that I think I didn't make it clear enough, and your comments made me realize this in the paper, that there is a sort of dialectic in how I define the revolution. So I start by saying the most common sense way of thinking about them is as this attempt to disrupt the fundamental structures of social, political, and legal order. And that's the sort of ordinary language approach to revolution. But then I go one step further and talk about Hannah Arendt's and the definition of revolution in science and revolution in the human realm, where I talk about this idea that most revolutionaries, and Arendt talks about this as well, thought of a revolution as a return to a natural order of justice and freedom. And so in that sense, I think, and this is something that you're right, I didn't make clear in my paper, I do think there is a kind of presence of the question of freedom in relationship to humanity in the definition of revolution. So we might understand on the surface every subversion of an order as a revolution, but actually, if you think of revolution like Arendt does, or as in this other tradition, which is about the return to order and justice for all humans, then there is a criterion of freedom there. So it's not completely non-moral. And so the theocracy, you might call it revolution, but it's not really a revolution. It's more like a reaction in this understanding. And this is something that wasn't actually made very clear in my paper, so thanks for helping with that. Okay, so then the question, and again, second thing I agree with you, with also maybe it wasn't made that clear, is that I agree with you that revolutions proceed by extra-constitutional, extra-legal means often, because it's part of the definition that you subvert a legal order, that you don't sort of start with that legal order, you act outside the law in many ways. And I think, and maybe again there's Luxemburg's quote that I'm using without kind of clarifying it, I think what Rosa Luxemburg was saying was that in every period, it's a bit like, again, like philosophy of science, where you have normal science and then a change in paradigm, scientific paradigm. And when there is a change of paradigm, then normal science is conducted within the paradigm. That means that you don't need a revolution for everything. So the way she understands this, and she doesn't unpack it either that much, but I think her intuition is that when she says, behind every legal order, there is a revolution, it means that this event takes place, and then other events occur in parallel, and some of them might be legal, so because other states realize that there is this risk for fundamental change, and so then elites begin to make compromises, and so those changes then occur within a reform framework. But what you do need is at some point a kind of jump, and this is and the jump may be violent or not violent, but that's not the question. The point is that in the transition from one sort of, let's say, constitution to another kind of constitution, you have maybe one occurrence, so I don't know, the Berlin Wall, for example. So that marks the change from a socialist order to a capitalist order. And what happens then, from then on, you have other changes in other countries, which can also happen from within the realm of the law, don't need to have extrajudicial or extra-constitutional means. So, but something needs to happen at one point for this change of paradigm somehow to occur. I don't know if that makes it a bit more clear. So I think, so in that sense, I think you're right that it is compatible with the reform approach, but what she's saying is that for certain reforms to begin to take place, you need a revolution, and then you enter a new paradigm, and then within that paradigm stuff happens, normal science again happens. This is how I think about it. I try and be brief. I think, so question of what Kant, maybe this is a kind of longer discussion just for you and me about Kant and revolutionaries. I don't think Kant actually ever said anything really critical about the French revolutionaries themselves. So we don't really have a lot of, I haven't come across anything where he says these were horrible people that did horrible crimes and so on, unlike many people. And if anything, the evidence that I was quoting from when he says, all the things that the Jacobins have done are more or less justified and so on. So that suggests that he also approved of the actions of the revolutionaries. And it's not part of his philosophical argument, you're right, because it is a lot about the spectator and the public sphere and so on. But I think I was just using that to say that, unlike many other people, Kant didn't really signal hostility towards also the actions of the revolutionaries. See if I have all my questions. I think, then maybe just one question back to Adorno and Benjamin and so on. I think Adorno and Benjamin had their critical eyes, they were criticizing a kind of irreversible teleology of history. So an account of progress as cause, and exactly this idea that I was trying to distinguish between Kant saying, a cause of progress is irreversible and a sign of progress is something that can be reversed. And in fact, I think Kant's argument is not teleological in that deterministic way. So there's nothing irreversible about Kantian progress, unlike maybe Hegelian or even Marxist one. So, and I think one can incorporate even Benjamin's argument about, stopping the brakes of the engine and so on, in an account of progress that works with Kantian criteria and in this, which operates with this kind of standard of judgment at its center, I think. Because as I say, there is nothing in Kant that says that progress is irreversible or it takes this direction, or there is no, I think, inherent teleology. The teleology is always based on the criteria of judgment, so on the standpoint of an agent who then reflects on what progress means and who applies certain criteria and uses that as a heuristic for going forward, this method of learning from the past. And I think that goes to your question, okay, so who is that agent then that does this, who operates, who acts this criteria? And for Kant, it's actually the public. So it's the public point of view that then is either, in the philosophers or in the professors who are the enemy or in the journalists or whatever. I mean, there isn't really one single answer to the question of who is the public. But the public standpoint, as it appears and materializes in various sites, is that which guides us. And I think it's what somehow answers this question of agency that you were asking for. And then how does it shed light to our contemporary politics, really final word? Well, it helps us understand what is the difference between regressive and progressive political movements. So it helps us have a standard of judgment from within which we can see certain movements in society that operate and act politically to kind of expand this humanity standpoint, to expand the humanity point of view, or to expand the Enlightenment, or however you want to cash it with Kant, or the Enlightenment understood as this kind of standpoint of the species, or that work to restrict it because they narrow it to one nation or to one culture or one religion, and so are regressive. And I think without the theory of progress of this kind, every political movement looks the same, and we don't have a standard for judgment. And I think maybe this is the most important contribution that it gives us to understanding the politics in which we are. Maybe in this room, this is like people know what's progress and what's regress, and so they don't need a philosopher to tell them that J.D. Vance and the MAGA people are regressive movements. But I think it helps to actually articulate exactly why. And often, in an account of politics that just pays attention to the dynamics of conflict, that sees the politics as pure power struggle, that has no moral criteria for evaluating political action, that is a little bit lost. And I think that's part of the problem maybe in the mainstream, is that in a lot of kind of liberal public sphere, those kinds of arguments about the relationship between morality and politics are lost.